What's the most shocking way someone you know became wealthy? Two of my best friends randomly married women who are incredibly wealthy, at least to me. One woman's father invented a medical device and makes millions in royalties every year. My friend knew she had money when they got married, but didn't realize how much until afterward. He contributes about 20% of his pay to the household, and the rest is basically fun money, since they aren't worried about retirement. He saves a little on his own in case of emergencies, but they will probably retire before 50. Another friend married a woman who inherited a business from her family. Her father made a couple of million and then sold the business to her over several years. She was a workaholic and bought him out after just a few years for a couple of million, grew it into a multi-million-dollar business, and then sold it to an outsider for several million. They put all of that money away and now work only to pass the time, so they don't touch their nest egg too early. On another note, a family member of mine worked their way into a C-suite executive role at a multi-billion-dollar company. No nepotism, no prestigious MBA, just a lot of hard work climbing the ladder. Their salary is about $250,000 per year, with a 25 to 30% bonus, sometimes more, once a year, plus 10 to 15% in stock options that vest over several years. Total compensation is around $400,000 annually. They once told me they try to live off their yearly bonus and save their entire salary. Story 2. I know this guy. We used to be kind of friends, but he grew up to be a bit of a twat who decided not to finish university. He was ridiculously into the transporter movies, so he got his driver's license instead, bought a small van, and started transporting stuff for anyone who paid him. He moved bands to small music festivals, parcels, construction materials, everything, with the obvious rule that he never checked what was in the bags. And he always reminded his customers of that. A few months into his business, a big company heard about him from one of the bands he worked with and hired him for a cross-country delivery because he was the cheapest. He got to the location, a big office building in the city center, was loaded up, drove across the country, arrived at another big office building, got unloaded, had his money transferred, and drove back home. The next day, the same company called him again for another cross-country trip. He did that, and then the next one, and the next. He drove for this company for a few weeks. Same route, same time, same stuff. He wasn't necessarily loaded, but he earned decent money just from this one company, so he bought another cheap van and hired his buddy to do other deliveries. When the company heard he had 2 vans now, they hired the other one too. By the end of that year, he had 5 vans with 5 drivers doing the exact same route over and over again. Then the company told him that the next delivery would be the last, but not to worry, they already had something lined up for him and his drivers so he wouldn't have to worry about money. He got to the new location, a huge warehouse with dozens of rows of racking and thousands of pallets of stuff. He was told they would eventually move all of it. He asked why they didn't hire a big logistics company with lorries, and they said they had heard great things about him. He was still cheap, and they weren't in a rush, so it was a win-win. He just shrugged and started moving stuff from this warehouse to another one across the country. He did that for a few months, day in and day out. Same warehouse, 4 hours there, 4 hours back, with 5 vans. This is when his life changed in less than 24 hours. One day, on the way across the country, he got a flat on the highway. He pulled over to fix it. The police showed up to help. They had a friendly chat. He changed the tire, finished the route, got paid, and went home. The very next morning, he got a call from the warehouse guys. They told him the company had finally decided to hire lorries, as him and his mates were taking too long. His services wouldn't be required anymore, but they wanted to honor their agreement and would pay him for the entire deal in one lump sum, with a little extra. I'm not sure if he realized what had just happened in that moment, or only when an enormous amount of money landed in his and his mates' bank accounts. From that point on, he immediately stopped bragging about this golden opportunity and only spoke about it to a very few people. To this day, we don't know who he worked for, and honestly, we don't even want to. But to understand the scale of things, the money deposited was enough for him to buy a small house in the countryside and retire at 28, with enough wealth that not just he, but his children, and maybe even his grandchildren, would never have to work a single day in their lives. Story 3. My friend trademarked a name and bought a domain for his small business. A major sneaker company later developed a shoe with the same name and purchased all his intellectual property for a substantial sum. He used part of that money to invest in his brother-in-law's business, a management software for industrial marine commerce. That investment made him millions. He's an average guy, not particularly ambitious, intelligent, or business savvy, just a good person with good luck. Story 4. I worked at Microsoft on a project called the HoloLens. It was fun, but after 10 years, the price was still too high and the headset too bulky. Microsoft decided to concede the consumer hardware market to Apple and others. So the project was canceled. My role was to make games for the HoloLens in a small studio within Microsoft called LXP. When the studio was dissolved, the lead left to start a new company and invited me to join. "What's the project?" I asked. "I don't know yet. We'll figure it out together," he said. 7 other guys agreed. They had savings or spouses who earned money. I didn't, so I said no. They named the company Against Gravity, since the HoloLens prototype had been called Grav-A, which I thought was funny. A year later, I saw they were making a VR chat app and giving it away for free. I felt good about my decision to pass on joining as the 8th member of the studio. The art looked like placeholder work. A few years later, my old PM Nick came on NPR's Planet Money. He was there to talk about how the little startup was now worth over $3 billion. Apparently, they had put the VR app, Rec Room, on mobile, and it was being considered a Roblox competitor, so they did figure it out together. Story 5. A distant family member worked at a gas station cafe. An old grumpy man came in every day for his coffee, and nobody liked him. She went out of her way to be friendly, asking about his day and sitting to chat when it was quiet. Sometimes long stretches passed with no customers, as they lived rurally. When he passed away, she learned she was to inherit his money, hundreds of thousands of dollars. He had no family and had appreciated her kindness, so he left her everything. She used the money to build a house and buy a construction company. Story 6. My mom's friend's daughter became a millionaire overnight in a strange way. Her father had walked out on the family when she was in kindergarten. No relationship, no child support, no visits, just gone. Her mother struggled for years to make ends meet. When the girl was finishing high school, her father was killed by a FedEx truck, and she received a settlement of $1 million. Story 7. The guy who invented smart food popcorn lives in my town, and we have some mutual friends. The unexpected part of his story is that popcorn wasn't his original idea. He had invented a resealable chip bag. When pitching the product to investors, he filled the bags with popcorn to demonstrate how they worked. The company hated the bag concept. Why prevent chips from going stale? That would cut into sales. But they loved the popcorn, a stoner's blend with Parmesan cheese. PepsiCo now owns Smart Food, and he is worth millions. Story 8. I heard from coworkers that a former colleague, laid off about a year earlier, had won first place in a World Series of Poker event in Las Vegas. The buy-in was $1,500 with roughly 1,300 participants, and the first place prize was $315,000. Not crazy money, and not the main event, but still very impressive. I check his results on the WSOP website from time to time. He seems to go to Vegas every few months to compete in several events, placing well enough to probably cover his trips and take home a few $1,000s, but nothing near as impressive as that first win. Story 9. My ex's mom and stepdad started caring for an elderly couple on their street, bringing meals, helping around the house, taking them to doctor's appointments, and so on. Eventually, the couple passed away. A little while later, they received a call from an attorney saying the couple had left everything to them. At first, they didn't think much of it. The couple had been poor, living in a small house in a modest neighborhood, with old cars and no fancy vacations. They were basically living just above the poverty line. Then the lawyer revealed the couple had left them tens of millions of dollars. They now live a very different life. Story 10. Something very similar happened to my aunt. She lived in an old neighborhood with modest houses and older cars. One of her neighbors was an elderly man who was partially deaf and had cancer. My aunt noticed he never came out to get his paper, so she started bringing it to his door, then helping with his mail, and eventually taking him to doctor appointments. He had a couple of kids, but they were never around to help. They became friends. After some appointments, she'd take him out for pie and coffee. Once, he said he wanted to be useful to her, so she let him watch her dog for 2 days while she went out of town. The dog ended up fighting a squirrel in the backyard, and when he tried to separate them, the squirrel bit him. She had to take him for a rabies shot in the butt, and they both laughed about it. After a couple of years, he passed away. She didn't expect anything. He hadn't lived a flashy life or owned much. It turned out he had changed his will 3 years before his death to include her. She inherited an entire large estate in Hawaii and a small yacht. His children hired lawyers and tried to make things messy. Being very religious, she didn't feel right keeping everything, so she gave them most of it. They settled by giving her a couple of $1 million. In the end, not a bad outcome, and she still had a friend. Story 11. Not wealthy, but a few years ago, Ring had a contest for the best Halloween video filmed on a Ring camera. My friend and her husband spent the whole weekend making one just for fun and submitted it. They ended up winning the national contest and $100,000 in prize money. It couldn't have happened to a better couple. They are two of the nicest people you'll ever meet. Neither works in a very high-paying field, so the money allowed them to buy a nice, modest house in a good neighborhood near downtown. We were all very happy for them. Story 12. My best friend from high school grew up poor. When his brother got married, he hooked up with a bridesmaid he met at the wedding, which turned into a long-distance relationship. It turned out he had gotten her pregnant the night of the wedding. Her family was very traditional, so she wanted to get married. He agreed, mostly to be near his child. She moved to our city, and they got married. Her father owns a massive company in the Northeast. About a year later, he missed his daughter enough to offer them a house, pay all their moving expenses, and give my friend a job at his company. For the last 20 years, my friend has had a job where he does almost nothing, gets paid a lot, and has no debt. They have 2 sons now and a very happy marriage. Story 13. A kid who lived down the street from me growing up tried to get me to invest our paper route money in buying domain names for established businesses that hadn't yet gotten on the internet in the mid-90s. I declined because I wanted to spend my money on dumb stuff. I don't know exactly how much he made from that, but it was enough for him to sequentially start several companies in web hosting and later cloud storage. Each company he started, he sold for increasingly larger amounts. Now, according to a Google search, he is worth over $300 million. Story 14. This didn't make me rich or give me FU money, but around 2010, I wanted to learn the basics of mobile development and created a flashlight app. Over its life, just a few years, the app generated about $80,000. It took less than 2 hours of work, and I had zero ambition for it. Much of that money went into my kid's 529 college savings account. My oldest graduates this year, and that money will cover their college. It was a decent amount, invested at a good time, and some more has been added since, though not in large quantities. Story 15. A friend of mine started doing yard work for the owner of his shop when the owner got sick. Over time, the owner opened up and let him into his house, which he was very embarrassed about because he was a hoarder. My friend kept everything quiet to avoid embarrassing him and helped clean it up. As the man's illness worsened, my friend kept him company and visited often, and they developed a true friendship. My friend was one of the only people the man had left at the end. When he passed, my friend discovered a special clause in the will allowing him to buy the house for pennies on the dollar. Now, my friend owns a house in an affluent neighborhood worth close to $1 million, but pays very little for it. Story 16. I have a friend who is an autistic loner type who never showed any entrepreneurial traits. He just worked at a large company as a regular engineer. At work, he befriended a manager, an older guy, old school and obnoxious with no formal education, who got everything through connections, made a lot of money, and wanted to start his own business. He was looking for a business partner who could complement his boldness and charisma with professional knowledge and education, and he chose my friend. My friend had the skill set but was young, broke, and inexperienced, so he wasn't a threat. Together, they formed a classic doer and thinker duo, like something out of a high cartoon, a love-hate relationship vibe. And they have been making millions running their own company for several years now. Story 17. A bunch of guys I worked with had a lottery pool in the mid-90s. They did that for about a year and somehow won a second or third prize payout, which they split up. I remember one guy paying off his wife's school loans with the money. A couple of others bought new cars. A few of them decided to do some work outside the office and got interested in e-commerce and interactive websites, technology that was just starting to take off. Their idea was to create an online listing site for vacation home rentals, searchable by location and text, and to charge landlords a listing fee. They sent paper mail advertisements to vacation areas and bought some online ads. Travel agency websites also agreed to host ads and links. Traffic went up steadily, especially after they registered the site with search engines like Yahoo, Lycos, and AltaVista. After a couple of years, they made back the startup costs, and for a couple more years, it became what they hoped for, an income supplement. They showed up at work tired sometimes as they kept improving the site, and by then, they seemed only minimally interested in their office jobs. By 1998 and 1999, all of those lottery guys were gone. A friend from the group later told me he had retired after the site was bought for millions by a major company. He was not yet 40 years old. Story 18. He had a small surf shop in the UK. In the 80s, on a surf trip to Australia, he ended up talking with some Aussies who had their own board short brand called called Billabong. He made a deal to use their name so he could print and sell t-shirts and board shorts with the brand logo from his shop. He also did a few deals with other surf shops in Tenerife and Portugal. The Australian company grew larger and branched out to Asia and South Africa, then became so big that they were looking at an IPO on the ASX. Before they could go public, they realized that the guy they had made the deal with owned the exclusive rights to their name and logo in Europe. They bought the name back from him, and the next day, he showed up to open his surf shop in a black Lamborghini Diablo. Story 19. Years ago, my dad's cousin and all the farmers in the area lost their cotton crops to unseasonable rain. The other farmers took their insurance payouts and gave up on the season. My dad's cousin, against better advice, decided to do a second planting. There was just enough growing season left and all the conditions lined up just right, so he ended up with a hell of a cotton crop. Being the only farmer in the area with a significant harvest that year, he was able to sell at a much higher price. He leveraged those profits to buy the cotton gin the following year, then used that income to buy more land and farms. Over time, he also bought into and invested in a number of other ventures. For a fellow who started as a small-time cotton farmer in the 1970s, he is now enjoying a very cushy retirement. Story 20. I know a guy who, around 2010, made an emulator app and ended up making millions. He was about 25 years old. He was a little socially awkward and always trying to buy things to get people to like him. Some friends felt bad for him, so we kept inviting him to things and tried to tell him he didn't have to buy stuff. He was very generous, and unfortunately, some people took advantage of that. Story 21. My father grew up poor in a shack on stilts in Ecuador. He managed to get a scholarship to the United States in the 1940s. Studied geophysics, graduated, and got a job with Standard Oil. He met and married my mother, a North Carolina native. They wound up in Cuba before, during, and after Castro, and eventually settled in Florida after being ejected from Cuba. The first thing my parents wanted to do did not work out, so they turned to a second idea with only $3,000 they had saved. They never took out a loan for anything. They got lucky, and they knew it. What they rode to their fortune was Chifle's plantain chips. When my father died in 2000, he was a multimillionaire. He and my mother both credited incredible luck and hard work all the way. I always said they lived the Horatio Alger story. Story 22. A neighbor who used to live next to me was a neurosurgeon in the 1960s who did not like the tools available to him in surgery. So he and his brother started a company making polarized surgical instruments and manufactured them themselves. They eventually sold the company for tens of millions in the 1990s. Almost all of the technology they invented is still manufactured today. He held around 25 patents. And his brother, who stayed a practicing surgeon while my neighbor ran the company, is considered one of the fathers of modern neurosurgery. Story 23. I was wealthy on paper. Then it was gone. In 2019, I bought about 12,000 Terra Luna crypto coins for about 34 cents each and then forgot about them. A year or so later, I checked and they were worth about $600,000. They kept going up until they were worth $112 each, a paper gain of about $1.4 million. I sold around $150,000 worth to do some major work on our home and was thinking about how to cash out more while minimizing taxes. Then, suddenly, in 2022, the Terra stablecoin broke its peg to the US dollar, and the value of Luna dropped from $112 to about 10 cents in 3 days. My investment went from about $1.2 million to $12 in 3 days. There was a very important lesson I learned. Take some of the profits on the way up. Story 24. A friend of mine got, I do not want to say wealthy, but certainly well off, due to a few interesting factors. We were at university together studying different subject areas, but we were part of the same club or society, 14 odd years on, and we all still meet up regularly. He went on to do a master's degree, and when he graduated, he received a golden handshake from a massive company, which he immediately used as a deposit on a house. He was paid fairly well, and most of his work was offshore. If he spent more than 6 months away, he did not have to pay taxes, or at least paid much less, though I am not entirely sure. When he finished a job or had time off, he would head out traveling to interesting places. While working offshore, he took every training course he could on every piece of equipment available. Then he was made redundant and set up his own company, basically contracting to do the same work he had been doing before. He was almost immediately signed on for a contract with the same company at 3 or 4 times his previous pay. One of the main reasons was that as the industry moved on and equipment was upgraded, there were only a handful of people who could competently operate some of the older gear. It was more efficient for them to pay him a fortune for that one job than to spend months training someone else. He is a really nice and humble bloke, always has time for people, up for a laugh, and always has a few crazy stories to tell. Story 25. This happened to a former friend of mine. She lived in her family house in upstate New York and worked as a trainer at a local gym. Her neighbor was an elderly woman, a former editor for the New York Times, no husband or kids, a first-wave career woman from the 1950s and 60s. My former friend started running errands for her, then cooking meals. The woman paid her, but not much. She was happy to do it because she liked her and had compassion. Over time, she became her home health aide, taking care of her right up until she passed away. When the woman died, my former friend discovered she had been left the bulk of the estate, including the house. But it turned out the woman wasn't just a middle-class former editor. She came from a wealthy real estate family. My friend apparently collapsed into a chair when she was told just how much she was inheriting. She's never told anyone the exact amount, but whispers put it in the low 9 figures. No one sees her anymore. She moved to the south of France and cut off most communication. One question we all had was why this rich old lady didn't hire a team of nurses to take care of her. I guess money can make people weird. Story 26. My cousin co-owned a factory manufacturing personal protective equipment, PPE, through a joint venture with several businessmen in China. Our family is Asian, but not Chinese. When he told us about the investment opportunity, with around $100,000 alongside several friends, many of us thought it was a bad idea. We knew very little about what it's like for a foreigner to own a business in China, but from conversations with people who had done it, we understood there were many obstacles and generally considered it risky. The factory initially lost a lot of money, and the other co-owners eventually exited the partnership, leaving him as the sole owner with significant debts. 8 figures. Then COVID happened. His factory became extremely profitable almost overnight. Face masks, in particular, surged in price at the beginning of the pandemic, and his factory produced and exported close to 1 billion masks in the first year, not including the other PPE products they were making. He has since sold the factory and is living a very comfortable lifestyle. Story 27. A career waitress at the restaurant I worked at while paying for college had a real soft spot for an older man who came in 4 or 5 times a week for lunch. Over the years, she got to know him, listened to his stories, and even bought him Christmas presents every year because he was so alone in the world. When he passed away, he left her a fortune. He had no real family. She had no idea he was wealthy. He was a very low tipper, drove a basic car, and dressed very plainly. Story 28. My uncle worked for a big company in the 70s, think Kodak or Bell Telephone, and they decided to close a very small division that wasn't making enough money. He worked in that division and decided to buy out the technology to start his own company. The cost was about 1 year's salary for him, and it was a big deal for the family, with several relatives contributing a few $1,000s each as investors. The business provided a nice living for his family, and the family members were all paid back. Then, in the 90s, looming Y2K worries caused companies to look at older technology to review and back up systems that might fail. From 1995 to 2000, they did 100 times the business, and in 2002, another tech reason arose for the work. He sold the entire company for $100 million. A neighbor of mine invented a very specific rendering process used in video game graphics in the early 2000s. It is patented and licensed to major game companies. And he still collects checks, having been effectively retired since then. He's the guy I point to when people worry that all their kid wants to do is play video games, because that's exactly how he got started. Story 29. I worked for a major vape juice manufacturer about 10 years ago. It had huge potential and was at the forefront of a booming new industry. They made insane amounts of online sales, but the business had just been started by 2 guys in a garage, and it grew too fast for them. They went through 4 CEOs in 4 years, spent tons of money on harebrained ideas and training seminars, practiced rampant nepotism, and hired and fired seemingly at random. It was a real mess. At one point, they brought in a new CEO who laid off about 25 people in one group right away. For some reason, everyone got 2 months severance. One of the guys I knew in passing dropped it all, about $2,500, into Ethereum, and less than a year later it had grown to around $450,000. About a year after that, the company shut down. Story 30. Back when CSGO first started accepting user submissions into the game, I told a friend of mine, who's a talented 3D artist, to look into it. Both of us played CSGO anyway, and we were around 18 years old at the time, so we had nothing to lose. His first submission got accepted, and Valve started paying him $25,000 per month for his weapon skin. He had to set up a business for tax reasons. Shortly after, he got another submission accepted and was pulling in anywhere from $40,000 to $50,000 per month. 10 years later, he's bought a nice house outright, drives a supercar, and is pretty well set for life. He still gets paid, though not as much as before since it gradually dwindled. He and I are still close friends, and he's done a lot for me over the years, so I'm really happy it worked out for him the way it did. Story 31. A former co-worker of mine got in on the ground floor of the NFT craze a few years ago. After he was fired, he divorced his wife and spent his time day trading instead of looking for a job. He met a guy on Discord who convinced him to buy a few Bored Ape Yacht Club NFTs. A few months later, the NFT market, especially Bored Ape, exploded. He sold his NFTs for a huge sum before the market crashed and put that money into other crypto ventures. It low-key pisses me off. He basically failed upward. He was in the right place at the right time and willing to take a stupid risk that wouldn't have paid off 99% of the time. Story 32. I had a drug addict friend who used to buy junk food and drugs online on illicit sites. He was an unemployed NEET, living off an inheritance for years, burning through it on stupid purchases every day and inching closer to overdosing with each one. How did he buy all this stuff online? With Bitcoin, buying off the Silk Road. When was he doing this? Around 2012 or 2013. You can probably see where this is going. The guy became a multi-millionaire almost overnight. He used his newfound wealth to get clean, moved out of the country, became a hardcore whiskey collector, though not a drinker, and is now living the rest of his life doing whatever he wants. He hoarded Bitcoin when it was around 2 cents a piece, so he ended up making an unfathomable amount of money. Story 33. A few years ago, a friend of mine unexpectedly came into a massive estate. He had no idea it was coming and suddenly had unlimited money to do whatever he wanted, travel wherever he wanted. He didn't have a loud personality, so he didn't flaunt his wealth. But there were signs. One sign was how often he went on vacation and flew home to see his family. What had once been every few months turned into every weekend. Another was his pay it forward mentality. If you were out to dinner as a group, he would quietly go to the waiter and pay for everyone. You never knew he was going to do it, he just didn't want people worrying about the bill. Sadly, he passed away this year from pancreatic cancer. You can't buy your way out of that. He invested a lot of his money, but never truly got to enjoy the long-term benefits. Story 34. I started leasing a ranch near the Bay Area in California in 1982. It's a little over 2,000 acres and very close to Silicon Valley. Ownership changed hands several times over the years, and I was always able to negotiate a new lease with the new owner. In the late 90s, it was acquired by an investor from Taiwan who also maintained a home in Hillsborough, California. All but one of his children went to Stanford and became MDs. The youngest chose to pursue technology. When he graduated, he had difficulty finding a job. I was an executive at a large tech firm in Palo Alto at the time and managed to give him a valuable role. He is now the CIO of a large firm on the East Coast. I also completely managed the ranch, dealing with local governments, fish and wildlife, trespassers, and people trying to start illegal weed farms. It was basically a big hassle all the time that my Taiwanese friend didn't have to deal with. We would meet once a year at a nice restaurant in San Francisco. I would update him on the goings-on at the ranch and pay my annual lease payment. In 2010, we met, and he told me he had stage 4 cancer and would likely be dying within the next year. He wanted me to buy the ranch because of all his many California land investments, this one was the biggest hassle, and he felt his adult children would not have the time or inclination to manage it. I told him it was worth far more than I could ever pay. He sold it to me for such a small amount that I was able to write him a check on the spot. The sum was so low that the title company called the Attorney General's office, and they investigated, assuming something nefarious was going on. I sold the ranch in July of this year for many millions of dollars. Over the years working together, I had come to be considered like family. I had helped his son and kept him out of the spotlight while managing all sorts of problems on the ranch. He valued both of those things, and in doing so, he changed my life. Story 35. My grandfather was just a regular guy working his whole life in a small local business and never chasing big money. One day, almost by accident, he bought a piece of land that everyone thought was useless. Years later, the city expanded, and a major company needed that exact area. They paid him far more than anyone expected. He didn't become flashy or change much. He just helped the family, lived comfortably, and stayed humble. It was one of those quiet, unexpected wins that came from patience and timing, not ambition. Story 36. I know a few stories like that. My favorite is a good buddy of mine who became an expert in a very niche field. So niche that if I named it, he'd be discovered. There are only about 3 experts on this subject in the United States. It has to do with construction. Whenever an architect makes a change to the blueprints involving this specialized area, they need someone to sign off on the plans, and he can charge basically whatever he wants. These 3 experts know each other and protect each other, sharing work between them. For example, my buddy might charge $300,000 to sign off on something, then call one of the other experts and say, "I'll give you $250,000 to do this job for me. I'd prefer to be on my boat this week instead." He still makes $50,000 without doing any work, just by subcontracting. He made so much money that he took a couple of years off. He even hired another friend of mine and pays him 6 figures just to answer his emails. He's a totally regular cool guy. Modest house, regular car, but he has toys, a ridiculous boat, a plane, and a helicopter because he wanted to get his licenses. He spends most of his time at the beach. Story 37. A guy in my hometown who worked the registration desk at my doctor's office ended up on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire back when Regis hosted. He was a nobody before the show, an overweight comic book nerd in his 20s, still living with his parents in a small blue-collar Midwestern town. To everyone's surprise, he won. He got the million, or whatever remained after taxes. He bought a nice 2-story home outside of town for himself. He fell in love with a very attractive nurse at the same hospital where he worked. But when the money ran out, which I imagine didn't take long even by 1999 standards, his spouse left him and he had to return to his registration job. You can still find him there to this day, albeit much older. Story 38. Throwaway. Because reasons. My ex and I were stuck living together after breaking up. Yay, paying rent in the Northeast. He offered to cover the entire electric bill if I let him run a server in the living room. Sure, not like I could bring dates home with him there anyway. One day, we're hanging out and I ask him what's on the server. "There's this thing called Bitcoin," he says. "It's digital cash that works without a bank. Because screw banks. Totally anonymous. You can mine it by letting your computer solve problems and it pays you in Bitcoin as a reward. Who knows if it'll catch on, but I like the idea." Cool, I thought. My friends and their partners all thought he was crazy. They made fun of him. He tried to get them into it, even showed them how to mine. A few coins. Both of my best friends, then partners, flat out banned them from doing it, calling him a conspiracy theorist, a loser, a dork. But I thought it was kind of awesome. Just seeing how passionate he was about it was contagious. Honestly, I had no idea if Bitcoin would pay off, but I was happy to let him cover the electric bill and watch my friend, who I used to date, get excited about something. About a year later, he supported me through a dating situation that had gone horribly wrong. We got back together after that and then got married near the end of 2012. A few years later, he cashed out. Let's just say we don't worry about money anymore. And that's why my husband gets to be a serial entrepreneur and a stay-at-home dad. My friends all regret laughing him off, but for whatever it's worth, I didn't see it coming either. Story 39. A quiet colleague I worked with was unassuming and rarely talked, except about football and his team. One day over coffee, he mentioned he had a letter from a solicitor and planned to see them later. A distant relative had died, and as the only living relative, he was inheriting the estate. Later, he discovered he had inherited 5,000 acres and a building site development, which already had 6 houses nearly complete and another 6 under construction. The estate was worth millions and continues to generate income. He bought me a beer. Story 40. I had a girlfriend who, on a whim back in 2011, put about $9,000 into Bitcoin. Her dad had given her the money, part of a total inheritance of $36,000 from her grandmother's estate. Most of it went to pay for the rest of her undergrad degree, and this was supposed to be her mad money portion. She wasn't interested in fancy clothes, expensive bags, or taking her boyfriend out to dinner. She liked tech and was fascinated by the idea of cryptocurrency, but she was too broke to risk much money. I was a little better off, but I wasn't sold on the idea either. More fool me. Over the next 2 years, she accumulated around 1,050 BTC, back when the price was under $10 per coin. Unfortunately, we were naive kids and had no real understanding of the risks. She kept it in multiple hot and cold wallets, but the largest portion, over 300 BTC, was on a platform called McGox. It promised some degree of safety, but ended up being rife with scams and eventually declared bankruptcy in 2014. She sold another large chunk, 400 coins when it hit $160 per BTC. How she waited that long, I don't know. I would have sold at the first major spike. That sale netted about $55,000 in profits. She set aside around 50 BTC in a speculative hold forever wallet and started selling the rest as they hit different targets. For a long time, though, she mostly just held because it wasn't really going anywhere. In 2017, she emailed me to let me know she was selling 120 BTC for a little over $4,000 each. Another roughly $450,000. She sold her last major block in early 2018 at around $12,000 per BTC for about $1.35 million. She wiped out her parents' debt and was kind enough, truly, to pay off my college loans and credit card debt. Later, tax rules changed and she owed more than she expected, but she still had high six figures sitting in her bank account, along with the 50 BTC in her hold till I die wallet, and she still has those coins, though I understand she borrows against them occasionally. All these years later, we're still friends. She's never married and is really frugal with her own money, but incredibly generous with the rest of us. For example, when my wife was 29 and diagnosed with ovarian cancer, we had terrible insurance because I was just starting my career in banking, and my wife was between jobs looking for something in her field. When my ex heard about it from a mutual friend, she stepped in and paid all our excess medical bills. Sometimes it really is decent people who just get extraordinarily lucky. Story 41. Growing up, one of my neighbors was going through a really rough patch. They were in the scrap metal business, exporting the metals they sorted. Policies changed, they got cheated, and ended up shutting down the business. They sold off everything except their house and the license to the business. Somehow, the neighbor had the foresight to keep making the annual license payments, even though the business was closed. He would borrow money from my dad to cover them. Fast forward about 2 decades. The policies changed again overnight. The business became extremely lucrative, and everyone rushed to set up new plants and secure licenses. He sold his license, which he had been paying around $5,000 a year to maintain, for over $2 million. Story 42. He was the sound guy at a small club. He had wealthy parents, so he wasn't really stressed about money, just coasting along. A band came through that he really liked, and he became their roadie. The band became semi-famous, and he worked his way up, eventually becoming their manager and earning producing credits, which gave him a lot of indie cred. Within a couple of years, working became a choice rather than a necessity, but he kept at it. Some of the songwriters he represented ended up hitting the lottery when major artists used their work. He makes a fraction of a fraction on a few mega singles, which turns out to be extremely lucrative. Story 43. I met a friend through a mutual acquaintance. He was in his mid-20s, a party animal, super goofy, enjoyed drugs, but was genuinely kind. He drove about 4 different vehicles, a couple of early 2000s Ford Focuses, a minivan, and a mid-90s Ford F-150, all beat-up cars that barely ran. It wasn't until about a year after knowing him that I realized he was very comfortable financially. He had gotten lucky, becoming president of a small-town bank right out of college, and had been buying, flipping, and renting out cheap houses in 3 different small college towns. I was told he makes a few $100,000 a year and saves most of what he doesn't invest. My mind was completely blown when I found out. Story 44. I knew an old lad in my town here in Ireland. He was a bit odd, what we'd call touched, but in a good way because he had a certain charm. Really shows how culchy I am now, LOL. Lovely old man, always stopping to chat. He lived just along the road from the older, very Irish supermarket with the great deli. He cultivated roses and had the sweetest little white cat, called either Baba Cat or the Rabbit, depending on how bold she was feeling that day. Just picturing a little town where everyone kept an eye on him, popping in with dinner for him and the cat when he wasn't well. There was one woman from Poland, living in a friend's box room with her son and working as a hairdresser. She would pop in once a week with a bit of shopping and cut his hair because it was physically difficult for him to get to the barber, and he liked it short for ease. Big head of snow white hair on him. All the years I knew him. I first met him as a teenager when I moved around the corner, and I'm in my 40s now. Life moves on, but he left a lasting impression. Anyway, he once told me that he viewed that Polish woman as a daughter and her little lad like his grandson. She had escaped an abusive family by marrying an abusive man as a teenager. Ireland was her escape, which is why she was living in a box room with her 10-year-old son. When he passed, she inherited everything. She and her son still live there, and she's now part owner of one of the best hair salons in what has become a cosmopolitan town, right on the Dublin commuter belt. She's minted. The house alone is worth a fortune due to its location, right across from an Aldi and a hospital on the old Dublin road, just an hour and a half from the city center. Fair play to her. A little bit of kindness really does go a long way. Story 45. I'll preface by saying it's not what I'd consider a huge amount of money, but it was life-altering for everyone involved. I had a coworker whose sister was about a month away from losing her home because she wasn't working and had run out of money. She was talking about moving in with my coworker and freeloading, which sounded like a nightmare because she was such a difficult person to be around. Then, out of nowhere, she was contacted and told that her ex-husband from many years ago had died unexpectedly while scuba diving alone. They suspect he hit his head on the underside of the boat, knocked himself out, and ran out of oxygen. It was strange, because he didn't have a history of going out alone like that. Anyway, she received a decent payout from his life insurance. I still don't understand how the money ended up going to her instead of his current wife. His current wife reached out, begging her to at least consider giving half of the money to their teenage son for college, but my coworker's sister told them to kick rocks. With her newfound wealth, she managed to keep her home. She eventually sold it and bought a much nicer house outright. Shortly after, she was diagnosed with cancer, which fortunately was very treatable. My coworker spent a lot of her own time and money caring for her sister, driving her to appointments, and helping her in any way she could. The sister, however, refused to undergo the recommended chemotherapy. Then the business we were working at was sold, and we were all looking for new jobs. My coworker was living paycheck to paycheck and couldn't afford to keep her apartment, so she went to stay with her sister in the new house, temporarily, as her sister made it clear she wouldn't tolerate a freeloader. My coworker continued to care for her sister, who was by this point completely immobile and needed assistance with everything. Meanwhile, her sister verbally abused her and wouldn't even let her stay in the guest room, forcing her to sleep on the screened-in porch. She told my coworker she intended to will the house to a humane society because she didn't believe she deserved to inherit it. Her sister gave her until the end of the month to find her own place or be kicked out. Then the sister died in her sleep. She had never updated her will, so by sheer luck, my coworker inherited the house and some money. It was just enough for her to continue living there for the rest of her life. Story 46. A friend of my dad was a surveyor in a poor area. Lots of people who had bought land decades earlier wanted to split it among their kids as their families grew. As the area developed, they'd sell off portions, but none of them had much money. So he would split the land one more time into small parcels, and that small piece became his fee. I worked for him occasionally, 10 or 20 surveys a year. Every time he was splitting land, he'd end up with a couple of acres. The area continued to grow, and he kept taking his fee in what everyone thought was worthless land. That area is Temecula. I have no idea how much he's worth now. He lives in a trailer with his longtime girlfriend, drives an old truck, and spends a little on travel a couple of times a year. He was very smart and retired young. He once told me, "It's just a high score and doesn't really mean anything. Just gives me something fun to do." He's a really nice guy, or at least he was. Story 47. A friend of a friend studied IT management and worked a few jobs, but he wasn't very good at them. He admits this himself, so he kept getting let go. Eventually, he landed a role at a tech startup as their first IT guy. The company had about 20 employees at the time, all pretty tech savvy, so he wasn't really needed. They just wanted an IT team on paper to look good for early investment rounds. He spent most of his days playing games on his computer for about 4 years. Apparently, he could count on one hand the number of actual IT issues he had to deal with, and he couldn't solve any of them, because the only issues that came up were super complex and he wasn't capable. But it didn't matter. The company just outsourced the problems and carried on. No one realized how bad he was at the job because he wasn't really needed. During those 4 years, he earned a normal salary and also received the same pre-IPO stock options as everyone else, mostly software engineers. He didn't care about the stock at the time, assuming it would never be worth anything. As the company grew, they brought in more people, including additional IT staff, who quickly realized he wasn't very good at his job, and he was let go. However, he was able to keep his stock options, which still had a few years before expiration. 3 years after leaving, he wasn't working in IT anymore. He had gone back to school to become an electrician or something similar when he received a notice from Solium, a corporate shares and options platform. It warned that his options were about to expire, so he needed to exercise them or lose them. When he looked into it, he found that in the 3 years since he left, the company had gone public and the share price had skyrocketed. He was sitting on tens of thousands of options. After exercising them and paying taxes, he walked away with just under $3.5 million. A failed IT guy managed to retire in his early 30s purely because of luck. Story 48. I do commercial real estate and was trying to buy a distressed commercial building. The bank had sold it to a guy who was hard to get in touch with. I finally set up a meeting, and he pulled up in a clapped-out Saturn wearing dirty sweatpants. I was very skeptical, but as he talked, I realized he had a huge portfolio, worth over $100 million. He told me he had been a motorhead in high school and started his own mechanic business. He began storing cars for banks that repossessed them, getting paid a daily rate to keep the towed cars on his lot. He admitted he would sometimes damage the cars on purpose, then get paid to fix them before auction. Very shady, illegal stuff. Through that, he met a banker who told him about a car dealership the bank had foreclosed on and couldn't sell. He put together a loan application and admitted he lied about everything, grossly inflating his income and ability to repay. He said he would have struggled to make the first payment, but he wanted the lot. Almost immediately after buying it, a broker contacted him. Walgreens wanted the location and would do a triple net lease, meaning they'd handle the building, maintenance, taxes, and he would just collect a monthly check. Instantly, a multi-million-dollar property. He used the funds from that deal to buy other distressed properties the banks didn't want. Despite having more money than he knew what to do with, he was still the same greasy, dirty fingernails motorhead guy. Story 49. This chick I used to work with quit her job to go work for Palantir back in 2019. Mind you, this was before anyone really knew anything about Palantir. They were some random pre-IPO company that dealt exclusively in government contracts, selling big data services. They didn't even pay that well back then. The base salary was around $120,000, and there was no 401k plan. On top of that, they gave her a bunch of pre-IPO stock that was basically worthless. Given that no one had heard of Palantir at the time, their low pay compared to big tech, the lack of a 401k, and the pre-IPO stock as a sign-on bonus. It had all the hallmarks of a company where management knew the stock was worthless and the company was mediocre. Anyway, she insisted she would keep all her stock and never sell because she believed in their mission or something. Fast forward to today, she's basically coasting through work, just waiting for them to fire her. Story 50. When my dad went to live near his parents after college in the 1960s, he worked at a U.S. government site on a project called Project Plowshare. The government was testing the use of nuclear weapons to create underground tunnels and spaces for bunkers. My dad's role for 6 to 8 months was to go to sites with a Geiger counter and check radiation levels. No radiation suit, no protection. Just drive a government pickup truck, park, use the Geiger counter, and report back. When my dad started dying of aggressive thyroid cancer in the early 2000s, I discovered that the U.S. Justice Department had set aside billions to compensate people who had worked at 1960s nuclear sites without protection and later developed certain cancers. I filed a claim, and a year later, we received over $450,000. Not a massive windfall, and I would have much rather had my dad back, but it was surreal, especially since my brother and I never expected to inherit anything from his lifelong lack of savings. Each of us used the money to make a massive down payment on a house. The weirdest part? I later found out my dad had once been posted outside Area 51 for a few days. Story 51. One of my friends from high school is a computer genius, but also a huge stoner. He didn't really realize how smart he was. I'll probably butcher the details because I never fully understand what he's telling me about his work, but I can at least tell the general story. We both went to the same university, and a couple weeks into the semester, I ran into him. He was talking about how he showed an assistant professor some of his computer projects. The professor geeked out over a program he had developed for aggregating data or something, and wanted him to show it to a bigwig in the department. Next thing I know, they were helping him patent whatever he had created, and he was busier than any other freshman I knew. By the first week of summer, he had moved out of the dorms into a luxury penthouse condo and bought a brand new Audi S4. Now, about 15 years later, he holds a bunch of patents and makes a ton of money while living on a beach in Mexico, getting baked. The lucky, smart a-hole. Story 52. My husband's good friend from high school. Mind you, they grew up in an extremely small town of maybe 1,000 kids from kindergarten through 12th grade. Eventually moved to a more populated part of the state after graduating. He's a tradesman, worked a union job, and became friends with an older man he worked with. Not best friends, but he was kind to the man, and they often grabbed food together or hung out in their off time. When the older man passed away, my husband's friend inherited everything he owned, millions in properties and estates, plus hundreds of thousands in investment accounts. He retired young and, last I heard, rode his motorcycle across the country. Edit to add, the friend had one family member reach out, the older man's brother. He admitted their relationship was strained and said he respected his brother's decision to gift his belongings. He just wanted a family heirloom, an old watch, which my husband's friend gave him. Story 53. A guy fell asleep at his computer and his head hit the keyboard. Turns out he was on a government website and accidentally caused it to malfunction, giving him full administrative access. He woke up, saw a bunch of random data, and just closed the PC. 4 hours later, 18 agents showed up at his house. They didn't raid him, but they made him explain how he gained access to literally the entire servers and data, with full admin privileges capable of wiping the entire service. He had to demonstrate exactly how he fell asleep and landed on the keyboard. It took them 18 days to replicate the accident, testing repeatedly until someone finally managed to reproduce it. In the end, they paid him $250,000 for his help. Story 54. My pothead friend heard about this weird thing called Bitcoin that was about to be introduced. He knew nothing about it, just heard some guy say it was a sure thing. We all made fun of him and tried to convince him it was a scam. He wouldn't listen, convinced it was his ticket out. He finally decided to spend an entire paycheck buying coins. This guy lived paycheck to paycheck, so it meant not being able to pay his bills or buy weed, and he spent 2 weeks begging us for free food. He spent $624 on Bitcoin at the start of 2010. Now, he's a millionaire pothead, and the rest of us are still living paycheck to paycheck. Story 55. My dad knew a guy who was studying to become a lawyer. He came across some obscure import duty law, researched it, and realized he could save a cereal brand tens of millions of dollars a year. He contacted the company and told them he could save them a certain amount each year if they agreed to give him 10% of the money saved for life. They initially refused and tried to figure out a way to do it without him, but couldn't. Eventually, they caved. He dropped out of law school and never had to work. Eventually, the import duty changed, so he stopped getting paid. But by that point, he had tens of millions of dollars and never lived an extravagant lifestyle. On a related note, my brother went to college with a guy who fell in love with and married someone from the De Beers Diamond family. Someone I went to high school with married a girl from a very wealthy family. He paints. Story 56. In the 1970s, my dad spent $15,000 to buy half of a failing local newspaper that his brother wanted to buy and run. He was a good publisher and grew the small paper into an important regional publication. Circulation went from fewer than 25,000 to over 180,000. In the early 1990s, my uncle sold the paper to a huge media company that owned dozens of newspapers. Between the rise of the internet and poor management, the paper was shuttered around 2002. My dad's $15,000 turned into several million without him having to do anything at all. He wasn't much of a risk taker. He always said he would rather invest in a business run by someone he knew well and wanted to succeed. He did lose a fair bit of money doing that too. The amazing thing was that he never lost a friendship over it, even when some of those friends and family members' businesses failed. Story 57. My dad worked in a very affluent New York suburb as a building inspector. There was a man in town who did nearly all the excavating, foundation, and paving work. This man was a multimillionaire and could probably buy and sell most of the people in this wealthy town. He had emigrated to the US from Poland with an 8th grade education and almost no English skills. But he had an excellent head for business. With help from no one, he built a huge construction company that made him a millionaire many times over. Another person, one of my in-laws, went off to fight in World War II. When he returned, he wasn't sure what to do next. He took a job as a plumber's apprentice and eventually became a plumber and then a master plumber. Over time, he built his own plumbing business and expanded into a full HVAC business. After the war, he married and, with his wife, settled just outside the state capital in a still relatively rural area. He purchased land in that area whenever he could. Time passed, and the business became the leading plumbing and HVAC company in the area. He began developing the property he had purchased, which had become a very desirable suburb outside the major city, and then turned his attention to commercial properties, rehabbing them, managing them, and leasing them to companies. He became a millionaire many times over. It really came down to a little luck and a lot of hard work. He passed away probably about 10 years ago. His sons still own the company and have continued to grow it. They weren't particularly interested in the real estate side, so they sold off many of the commercial properties and reaped the benefits of decades of growth. Story 58. My uncle married a woman who worked in tech back in the 1990s. She was nice enough, but early in their marriage, she went off the rails into mental illness. She quit her job and devoted all her time and energy to delusional beliefs, even writing what she claimed was a new version of the Bible. My uncle essentially became her full-time caregiver until she passed away in the 2000s. After she died, while sorting through her assets, he discovered that back in the 1990s, before they got married, she had bought a ton of tech stocks, including Apple and Amazon. He sold it all, quit his job, bought a cabin in the mountains, and today, he and his new girlfriend just go on hikes with their dogs every day. Story 59. I know someone who went to work for a startup during the tech boom in the 1990s. Sometimes compensation was given in stock, which was almost worthless at the time because there wasn't always enough cash for full pay or bonuses. He stuck with the company, and it kept growing. His mom was always trying to get him to leave for a job that would actually pay him, but he refused and stayed the course. That company was Microsoft. He's now insanely rich from all the stock he accumulated. Story 60. My friend Jerry, who no one would suspect was wealthy, recently passed away and left his entire holdings, $46 million, to various charities. I'm 74 and have known Jerry since I was 5. He grew up a few doors down from me. Jerry never married and lived in the same house his entire life. The house was built in the 1950s and is probably less than 1,500 square feet. My current bedroom is larger than his living room. Jerry would buy a new car about every 7 or 8 years, usually after putting around 300,000 miles on it. He hardly ever bought new clothes and would wear them until they literally fell apart. He had a modest salary as an accounting professor and women's head basketball coach at Wilmington College in Ohio. Yet he accumulated unbelievable wealth, a result of his frugal lifestyle. Jerry began building his fortune by joining an investment club while in college in the mid-70s and 80s. It's been speculated that he bought stocks in Apple, Microsoft, Oracle, and other high-flying tech companies, and never sold. Everyone who knew Jerry was stunned when the news of his charitable donations came out. Story 61. My cousin YOLO'd into Dogecoin because he loved Shiba Inus. He accumulated millions of coins from mining and buying over the years. In 2021, the value skyrocketed, and he sold a portion, living a wild life. The problem is, he loves drugs, women, and cars without restraint. After some wild binges, many women abroad, and several crashed cars, he's back on the low again. I haven't really talked to him much since I've never liked his personality, even before the money, so I don't know how he is these days. Still, he always wanted to live the high life, so at least I'm glad he got to experience it. Story 62. I knew a guy who was the ultimate what-if story. He co-founded a biotech research firm in grad school, but sold his shares for a pittance right before the company became a multi-billion-dollar empire. He spent the next 20 years teaching high school chemistry. When he received a terminal cancer diagnosis, we all felt terrible because we knew he didn't have the money for quality treatment. Then, suddenly, he was paying for top-tier private doctors in cash. He told us his old biotech partners were giving him a grant, and we all believed him because of his background and his contributions to the company, even though he had missed out on the big payday. It wasn't until much later that the truth came out. He hadn't gotten a grant. He had used his chemistry degree to manufacture the purest crystal meth the market had ever seen. He didn't need the biotech firm to become wealthy. He just needed his cancer diagnosis to remove all inhibitions about pursuing wealth. He went from a struggling teacher to running a $100 million drug empire. Story 63. Honestly, Bitcoin. A friend bought a good amount back in 2010 and told all of us it was the future. We all gave him some solid side-eye, made jokes, and told him his electronic, imaginary money was a waste. He sold a good portion in 2022, still has a lot, and is very wealthy today. You'd never know it talking to him. He doesn't drive a crazy car or flaunt his wealth. He didn't quit his job. He just quietly amassed a fortune. 15 years later, I still don't understand how cryptocurrency works. As much as I'd like to say I'd go back and tell myself to buy it, there's nothing anyone could have said in 2010 that would have made me believe it would be worth what it is today. Good for him, though. He's the nicest dude. Story 64. I was at Sun Microsystems when they went public. There were about 70 instant millionaires. Within a month, the parking lot looked like a Porsche dealership. I joined Sun 2 days after they stopped offering the really good stock options. Or I would have been rich, too. A friend of mine was a researcher at SRI. One year, there was this new thing called the World Wide Web. He and another researcher decided to play with it and create a web page showcasing all the interesting work being done at SRI. Management liked it and asked them to make the page nicer and update it regularly. My friend and his colleague said, "We're researchers with PhDs, not IT guys." So they taught the staff librarian how to write HTML and let him handle it. 2 years later, that librarian left SRI to join a web-based startup. He's now very rich, and my friend is still a researcher at SRI. Story 65. I know a guy named Don who owned a head shop in Chicago in the late 1960s. He was making decent money, more like richest guy in your neighborhood money rather than real wealth. People kept coming into his shop from Canada asking for job rolling papers. Don called every distributor he knew, and either they had never heard of them or had other people asking as well. Since Made in France was the only clue on the label, Don found an attorney who specialized in French commerce. The attorney eventually tracked down the company and sent a letter asking how Don could sell their products in his shop in Chicago. A few weeks later, the attorney received a letter inviting them to the company's headquarters in France. Long story short, leaving out some of the best bits, they offered to sell him the exclusive U.S. rights for $30,000. Granted, $30,000 in 1971 is roughly $240,000 today, but still, Don had only wanted to sell the papers in his shop, and here they were offering him the exclusive U.S. rights. He and the attorney signed immediately. I haven't heard about him lately, but I know he was worth around $20 million in the late 1980s. So if you've ever bought a pack of job papers, thank my friend Don for that. Story 66. A guy I went to school with was a genuine amoral sociopath. He was pretty good at faking being an almost normal human, but the cracks always showed. After graduation, he got into self-help as a way to manipulate people and ended up starting what I can only describe as an MLM cult. It never got very big, maybe around 100 people, before he was arrested for some form of fraud related to the scam. He made a lot of money for a few years, though. If you had asked me in high school, I would have told you he'd make a good salesman. I just never realized how good. Shame it was all fraudulent, but honestly, that shouldn't have surprised me. Story 67. I have one story that fits the big payday mold and one that's the opposite. A guy I went to high school with, he was a couple of years ahead of me, got a job around 1994 or 95 with a company building a web-based job search site. They launched the site in 1996. This was early internet stuff, running on Sun and SGI hardware and coded in C. The site was Hot Jobs, and my friend was one of the founding employees. He cashed out big when Yahoo bought the company for $436 million in 2002. The other story involves my cousin, who went to school at RPI around 1997. At the time, their dorms had one of the fastest internet connections you could get, so he got online and ended up testing some popular software a guy had created. The guy invited my cousin to work with him full-time, but it felt like a crazy risk, so he declined. The guy was Justin Frankel, and the app was Winamp. In 1999, his company, Nullsoft, was acquired by AOL for $400 million. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.